Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery, and what I've got in my sights for today are these yellow buckets that you see down here. They're labeled as buckets number 3, 4, and 5, with European night crawlers living in them. I believe that they're now 68 days of age, so just a little bit over 2 months old, and they've been fed 5 times. That last feeding, the 5th feeding, occurred 20 days ago, and 10 days prior to that, 30 days ago, we put in some corn cobs. Corn cobs are typically a food that take quite some time to break down, but those corn cobs that were placed into these 3 buckets 30 days ago were soaked for a couple of weeks. And the thought was that by soaking them, that the material that the corn cobs are made up of might soften up a little bit, possibly increasing the speed at which those corn cobs get broken down. So the last check-in on these bins was only 10 days after the corn cobs had been put in there. We didn't see a lot of progress, which is pretty normal. But today, 30 days after the corn cobs went in, I'm curious to see what we see. So I'm going to get these up on the bench, get a glove on, and I got a little bit more food for them today, coffee today. And we'll see how the corn cobs are coming along. So let's get to work. Oh yeah, I almost forgot. Besides coffee, I threw in a couple chunks of watermelon just because all brown seemed a little boring. Figure let's dress up the feeding with a little bit of color, a little splash of moisture too, which can't hurt. So the last feeding was just an assortment of different veggie scraps, and then what we did was we sprinkled in a nice top dressing of leafy matter. And then on went the plastic covering, and it's not too surprising that the plastic covering would cause the recirculation of the moisture down in the bin, causing the leaves that were sprinkled out here on top to become a pretty popular spot for the worms to come up and hang out in, to not only enjoy the moisture but to also nibble on the leaves, because the leaves are not only a bedding material but they're also their food eventually. So my thought was just that these leaves would get blended in the process of the system getting checked in on. So why don't we dive down the middle, which is where the last feeding had been applied, to see if we can locate the corn cobs, to see how they're progressing. Similar to last time, I can see a couple worms that have began burrowing down into the corn cob, I guess right between the little gaps where the kernels attach to the cob. And another thing I often expect to see is that the inside, the soft portion of the inside of the corn cob, would begin getting hollow as the worms begin chewing that stuff away too. And I'm very tempted to try snapping these corn cobs. I mean, if you were to just use a couple of your fingers to try to snap a chunk of corn cob, you might find that a little bit difficult to do, unless you've got very large and strong hands. But I assume that at some point the structure of these corn cobs will deteriorate to the point where it would be easy enough just to snap them or crush them. And it is tempting, but I also like the idea of just letting them remain intact to some point, to some degree, rather than crushing them up, because then all of a sudden we just got a bunch of crushed bits of corn cob everywhere, and at that point it's not quite as easy to follow along with the progress that the worms are making on this stuff. So I'll resist the temptation of crushing the corn cobs and leave them intact for the most part. So I thought that the food that we give them today, in addition to the old food that they already have, could possibly just get sprinkled in on top of the leafy matter that would be dropped down into the feeding zone too. We're a little bit limited on space in these somewhat small containers, so I'm not sure how it'll go in terms of submerging everything we're adding today. I'll certainly do my best. And let's see here. Normally in the worm buckets I don't worry so much about deploying feeding zone indicators, but in this case we could, since each batch of coffee that each system is receiving has its own filter. So we can actually mark where we last fed after we've covered up and backfilled. Let's also include a little bit of the crushed eggshell, which is the material that I use as grit to go with my feedings. And now I think we can loosely cover up. I don't even know, did we till up the outer edges? I don't think we did. Perhaps we can even fluff things up and aerate a bit more so that covering things up becomes a little bit easier by doing so. And I believe that what we saw with those corn cobs today is pretty much on par with what one would expect. I guess the only twist is the fact that those corn cobs had been soaked in water for an extended period of time, making me wonder if perhaps we might see something a little bit different. I guess the possibility always exists that we'll see nothing different, that soaking them made no difference whatsoever, but I guess that's the whole idea behind experimentation, right? Change a variable, see what you see, and sometimes you see a difference. So that's it for bucket number 3. Let's nudge things over and move on to bucket number 4. Usually when I've got multiple systems like this that are the same age, set up the same way, same number of worms in each, I guess in this case we've got an estimated 1,275 worms in each of these buckets. When I've got this sort of rinse repeat setup, I'll treat the check-in on the first system as the opportunity to see how things are in a somewhat more detailed fashion, and then assume that we're going to see much of the same in the subsequent check-ins. So by doing it that way, I feel like I can pick up the pace a little bit and do a little bit less of the exploring and theorizing, and just get down to the business of giving them their food. Yeah. It's always kind of cool to see how the worms just get all over one of these corn cobs, so they clearly like this stuff. So the speed at which it breaks down has nothing to do with whether they like it or not, because they clearly do like it. I think the speed at which the stuff breaks down is more directly related to just the nature of the food being somewhat more I guess more fibrous, tougher type stuff, which the worms find a little bit more difficult to break down, resulting in a greater amount of time for it to get eaten. So, oh, look at that, how much mold. Some of these coffee filters with the coffee in them have been sitting around for a couple weeks now. And it is kind of interesting to see how the mold has developed on this stuff, which shouldn't be any reason for concern because it's stuff that the worms definitely enjoy. Mold is just one of those things that the worms eat along with the other stuff that they're given. So from the worms' point of view, it's just more yummy food to be consumed. You can definitely see the number of worms in this system, and all 3 systems are quite high. Almost every handful has many, many worms in it, which is always good to see. It's nice that the material is pretty consistent too in terms of its moisture level throughout. So that one went pretty quick and easy, and that leads us to getting this one covered up so we can move on to feeding the last of our buckets, which is bucket number 5. So on to the last bucket and we'll be finished. Alrighty. Not sure what happened here. Perhaps just me picking it up the way I do caused the plastic to get shoved off to the side. It's weird. I guess maybe that happened when I was putting the systems away, because all this leafy matter out here stayed quite dry. I mean, I'm definitely a fan of doing things in a fairly consistent fashion when I'm running sort of twin bins, or perhaps in this case triplet bins. But in this case, somehow the the recirculating moisture was denied of these leaves, causing the leaves to stick around a little bit longer in this case, for these wormies to enjoy a little later rather than sooner. I guess that also resulted in the worms spending less time on the leaves and more time on the stuff down low, which might result in a higher density of casting material down within the bed. But I'm sure over time everything will sort of even out, and these leaves will catch up in short order and get broken down by the wormies once they've been submerged down into the system as the foundational bedding onto which we place today's yummy meal of coffee and watermelon rinds. And every now and then I sort of have this thought in the back of my mind in terms of how consistent or inconsistent I was, and for some reason I'm questioning whether or not I added grit to the last system. Did I skip it? Did I forget? I guess I could have. But sticking to my typical mode of operating, I'm not going to try to go back and make up for something I've missed. It'll just have to remain that way, and like most things, even if there is a little deviation from the standard or the norm, things generally even out for the most part, so I don't think that the worms are going to miss the sprinkling of eggshells, if in fact I did miss it in bucket number 4, but who knows, maybe I did and I just forgot. So that's it for our check-in with the European night crawlers in these yellow buckets. They all seem to be doing quite nicely. Luckily the fairly small piece of bubble wrap that is used to cover these systems is doing a nice job helping the systems hang on to their moisture. And I also do believe that just the amount of sidewall on these containers causes the little bit of moisture that does get by the plastic to sort of remain down in there and not get blown away, creating sort of a high humidity zone down here within the bucket. So it does seem to me like these pieces of plastic are just the right size for these size containers. So that's it for the check-in, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks so much for watching. Bye-bye.